Hi, welcome to Swords to Plowshares. I'm joined again by my friend Kathy, and today we're going to be going over 1st and 2nd century Christianity, especially focusing on the connections between key people in 2nd century Christianity and sort of following the lineages of where they came from and who taught them, and kind of trying to trace the origins of things back into the 1st century. So we're going to be using a few different sources. We're going to be using a lot of what Irenaeus says, but then we're also going to be using other sources that look at the history of things. So Hippolytus has some things to say. And so this is just kind of an overview, because if we're going to look at some of the texts individually, we'd want to know what are we looking at. And I think in order to get kind of a bigger picture perspective, that helps to sort of decide where things belong when we zero in on them. So hopefully this will be a good way to sort of show what the roadmap looks like. And this is definitely not a complete roadmap. I tried to make it as simple as possible to keep it simple, but also complex enough to include enough key information. So that's kind of why this is half complicated and half simple. So where to begin? I think one place that would be good to begin is just from the top. So
From the top and work to the bottom. Okay.
Well, let's start at the top, and then I think we're probably going to start kind of at the bottom. So I just want to point out that at the top, the origins of these things begin with John the Evangelist, if we're talking about this chain that goes to Polycarp, to Pothinus, and then to Irenaeus of Lyon. But then we also get this other chain that goes from John the Baptist to Simon, and then to Cerdo, and then to Marcion. And then this also from Simon, you go to Menander, and then Saturninus, or Menander, Basilides, and to his followers. So you get kind of these chains where Simon is a key person who's a follower of John the Baptist. And then to the right, you have Paul, which he evidently had a follower named Theodas. And then Theodas had a follower named Valentinus. And then the Valentinus, he's the Valentinians, which he had a whole bunch of Valentinians. And he was one of the major people in the 2nd century. So then we also get James, who is the head of the church of Jerusalem. And the Jerusalem church is what's known in the 2nd century as the Ebionites. And so then we'll talk a little bit more about that, like how that plays into all of these things. But I just want to kind of point out that that's its own thing. And of course, that comes from Jesus. But then John and Jesus are kind of working together. But then you have this Peter, where it's not really clear kind of whether Peter is someone different than Simon or whether he's the same person as Simon, because some people talk about them as if they're the same, and some people talk about them as they're different. So we have Simon Peter, and does that mean he's someone totally different from Simon, or is he someone who's like confused throughout history? And so he's a huge person in the early church. And we see some things with James and John. As we see, we have John the Evangelist and John the Baptist. Are those the same person, or are they not? And so there's like a lot of kind of these key people that go all the way back to the beginning. There's like all these kind of question marks and strange things that go on when we get back to the 1st century. So instead of starting in the 1st century, I think we should kind of start in the middle of the 2nd century, or middle toward the end, and kind of work backwards. And then maybe you'll see how some of these things might have gotten the way they did. Are you following so far?
Excuse me. Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So one of the reasons why I think we should start kind of in the middle of the 2nd century is because that's where we get the most clear, or the clearest sort of literature and attestations of things. Where in the 1st century, it's all muddled, and depending on who you ask, you're going to get a very different story. And so when we kind of start with the middle to late 2nd century, you have Irenaeus of Lyon, which is at the sort of bottom left-hand side, where it says Proto-Orthodoxy, Irenaeus of Lyon. You see that?
Is it? Wait, yeah, Proto Orthodoxy. Yeah, Irenaeus of Lyon. Yep, France. Yep, or
Okay,
likely
so
in Smyrna.
Yep, and he wrote a book called Adverse Heresies, which is Against the Heresies. Actually, had a longer title, but that's sort of the shortened version. But it's known as AH. So anytime you see like AH 2.13.2, that's Against Heresies, Book 2, Chapter 13.2. And so
Okay.
that's one of the, I'd say probably definitely a top 5 most important books in church history outside of the 1st century, where he basically in that text gives us a roadmap. And now it's not clear that everything he's saying is accurate, but he's at least giving us a perspective of what things look like around the year 180 or 185, which is toward the end of the 2nd century. And he's sort of cataloging all these different groups and all these different teachers within the groups and trying to trace some of these genealogies of where the groups came from. And he's detailing what a lot of these groups are teaching and naming some of the texts that are in existence that they're using. And so now that we found a lot of these Gnostic texts in the Nag Hammadi library, we can actually map on some of these specific texts, like the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip. It's like, oh, well, those are being used by the Valentinians. But then also some of the texts that aren't named, we can know just by what kind of doctrines are being put forth in these texts, which of the groups that they most likely belong to. So his Against Heresies is one of the most valuable texts in trying to recreate church history from the 2nd century backward. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. Sounds like a good book to have on your library shelf.
It is. And it's about 250, 260 pages, depending on which version you're using. So it's not that long, but it's got some dense reading as well. And it's extremely valuable for what I'm doing with like source criticism, because anytime he mentions a text or mentions a person or says stuff about a group, then it's really valuable. So basically what Irenaeus was, he was the 2nd Archbishop of Lyon in France. So it wasn't called France, it was called Gaul back then, but it's the territory of France. And the first archbishop was this guy Pothinus. And this archbishopcy of Gaul was something that began in the middle of the 2nd century. Now, I think the numbers that I've seen were around the year 150, but it's kind of a guess. There's not clear records of when it first began. But based on all these other things that are occurring, I think it's probably closer to 140, because it seems like at the Bar Kokhba revolt, after that time, all these groups started exploding in popularity. And so that was kind of the key moment in the 2nd century, was the Bar Kokhba revolt, and that sort of redefined Christianity. And because prior to that point, it was Jewish, and I guess now is a good time to talk about this. So are you familiar at all with the Bar Kokhba revolt, what it is?
You and I have talked about it a little bit, but not a lot, and I'd need a refresher.
Okay. So in the year 70, that's when the temple was destroyed, when there was this sort of revolt against Roman occupation, and that was the sort of Roman response, was to destroy the temple. So that was sort of the first major kind of landmark thing that occurred in Christian history. But then that didn't destroy Jerusalem. People left Jerusalem, but then they came back because they just basically went in and there's a big fight and they destroyed the temple, but they didn't destroy the whole city. It wasn't until this Bar Kokhba revolt, which occurred like 60, 65 years later, when they had this another revolt against Roman occupation. And this time, instead of just destroying the temple, They leveled the entire city of Jerusalem, and they made it to where no one who's Jewish can come back and live in Jerusalem. And Justin Martyr, who's writing in like the 150s, he said even in his time, the Romans were not allowing anyone Jewish to come live in Jerusalem anymore. So this was something that was like this was I think the bigger one. Even though the temple was destroyed in the year 70, this was really the one that I think was even more defining. And so this Jerusalem church, which was under James, Jesus appointed James to be the head of the Jerusalem church, and we get this in the gospel. Yep, we get this in the Gospel of Thomas, saying number 12, where he says, who's going to be your leader after you leave us? And he says, James will be your leader. And we get this in the book of Acts, chapter 15, where whenever the Jerusalem council meets and they have to make a decision, James is the one who's making the decision. So, and all the attestations basically agree that James was the guy who was in charge of the Jerusalem church. And now what's interesting is, since he was the first, what later became known as a bishop, he was the first bishop of Jerusalem, which was the main church. There were a succession of, I want to say it's around 12 or 14, something like that, bishops down to Judas. And all of them have Hebrew names. So it's always someone who is of Hebrew descent in charge of the Jerusalem church. And the Jerusalem church is the main church that's sort of influencing all the other churches. And now at the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Judas is the main bishop of this Jerusalem church, after that point, when they're no longer allowed to be in Jerusalem and they're cast out, and this Jerusalem church has to move or disperse or whatever occurred, now from that point on, the next one after Judas was Marcus, and that is a Greek name. And then every bishop after Marcus has a Greek name. So it's interesting so everyone before Judas, everyone before the Bar Kokhba revolt had a Hebrew name. Then everyone after the Bar Kokhba revolt had a Greek name. So it's not clear. There isn't, at least I haven't come across clear historical sources that would explain in detail why this is the case. But the fact that that is the case means that something significant occurred with the Jerusalem church at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, when all the Jews were cast out of Jerusalem. So it's interesting that event coincides with some major things that occur throughout the rest of Christianity as well. So that's also the time when Marcion begins teaching in Rome and gains a big following in Rome. Valentinus also is teaching in Rome and gets a big following in Rome at that time. And then Pothinus becomes an archbishop of this newly founded church in Gaul, and he starts teaching things there. And that's who gives rise to Irenaeus, who's the second bishop after him of Gaul. And so like all these major things that occur throughout all the different groups of Christianity in the 2nd century all seem to occur right after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So I think there's a huge connection there, when I think prior to this point, Christianity was primarily Jewish. And after this point is when it sort of had this, like all the sort of more Greek influenced versions of Christianity sort of exploded in popularity. I can't say why. I'm not sure exactly why, but I just want to kind of point out that is a huge point in church history.
Right. And I know I had questioned that before, like when did the church move away from its Jewish roots, right? In the early church, it seemed like it was to continue in its Jewish roots, but at some point then it didn't. And this looks like possibly maybe something here is where that occurred.
Yep. And a lot of people, they'll take everything in the New Testament and throw it all in the 1st century. And then they say, well, everything else that's not part of the New Testament is 2nd century or later. And so all of these things that are in this, like Marcionites and Valentinians and like all the things that didn't make it into the New Testament, the way of explaining all of these texts is they say, oh, well, they were just using the New Testament texts and did a whole bunch of weird stuff to them. And like, that's why they exist. Who knows what they were up to? But now that we actually have a lot of the literature ourselves and are able to know a whole lot about these groups, and that they're not just all lumped into this Gnostic category, but rather we know like who was in charge of each group, and where they came from, and when they were teaching and where they were teaching and who their followers were, and we kind of piece together all the details of it. The picture ends up being quite a bit different than that, where some of these texts that are in the New Testament did not exist in the first century, but rather were created in the second century, and some of them were dependent on some of these second century texts as well, and that some of these texts that we thought were second century are actually first century. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Not today, but just wanted to point that out.
Awesome. Interesting.
So one thing that, and again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to just ask them. But the Marcionites, have you heard of Marcion of Sinope or Marcion of Pontus?
Yeah, I have. You and I have talked about him a little. I've heard about him through Greg Boyd or some of his writings and his books, and but I'd have to get a refresher. What you use, you keep. What you don't use, you lose. And I don't use this often enough for it to just, be fluent. But yeah, I've heard of Marcion.
All right, so I'll refresh you. Marcion is sort of in the bottom, not all the way to the right. You have Valentinians is to the right, but then to the left of Valentinians, you have Marcionites.
Yep.
So Marcion, the thing that he's typically known for more than anything, well, I guess there's two things he's really known for. One is that he allegedly believed that the God of the Old Testament was an evil demiurge. The creator of the world was an evil demiurge. And demiurge just means like creator. It was a Greek Platonic term. But then Jesus is not the son of this evil demiurge who created the world, but rather he is the son of the real God, which is higher than the demiurge that created the world. And so Jesus came to save us from the demiurge and the world of flesh and suffering, and to return us to this eternal realm with the true God, who is greater than the God of Genesis who created the world. Have you ever heard something like that about Marcion?
Yeah. Yeah, that rings a bell.
So having read, now most of Marcion's texts have been lost to history, but we have lots of attestations about him. He's one of the most popular, I guess popular is the opposite of the right word, I guess unpopular, most infamous characters of the second century church, where you have Tertullian writing against Marcion is the name of his book, and it's a multi-book series that it's all just against Marcion, where he's like basically saying why Marcion is wrong and is evil. And then you have Irenaeus, who's also speaking against Marcion. You have Justin Martyr, even earlier than that, who's a contemporary of Marcion, who's speaking against him. And so you have all these people talking about Marcion in a negative way, and we don't have any of Marcion's texts to read for ourselves, but his opponents often quote him. So we do have a lot of the things that he says, assuming that his opponents quoted him correctly. And so we do get a sense of what he was teaching. And I think the one thing that I think people tend to get wrong about Marcion, and probably what his opponents, either intentionally or unintentionally, got wrong about him, is I don't think that he was teaching that the God who created the world is actually evil. I think he's building a system based on something that does go back to Jesus, I think, and that is that there's an Elohist and a Yahwist source in the Torah. And so he was teaching that there's a distinction, that the Elohim God of Genesis 1 is different from the Yahweh God of Genesis 2. And so he's saying that this Yahweh God of Genesis 2 is not the real God, that the real God is the Elohim of Genesis 1, because we see
Is
that
it okay?
we see that in Ebionite teachings, we see that in Marcionite teachings, we see this in basically all of the Gnostic texts as like an explanation of their systems, is that it's all interpreting Genesis. And so I think that that was kind of the primary teaching that ended up becoming all these different schools of thought. So I don't know that he was saying that the God of Genesis was evil. I think he was saying this is how to read Genesis correctly. Go ahead.
So would that explain the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? You have the Elohist and the Yahwehist, right? Is that
Yep,
what
I think
kind of?
that's what they were saying. Yep.
Yeah. And so you have two different. Okay, but that makes sense. You know, Alan, the wizard, Alan Horvath, would talk about this some too, and he was an Elohist. He believed that the name of, Elohim. He didn't use. They still used. They interchanged it though, because he would talk about Yah, and he made a ring with the symbol for Yah, so that he would still use Yah as well. But I don't think he even made the connections that there was two different ones. If
A lot of people
that's
don't,
true.
and if
Yeah.
you don't study second century Christianity in depth, there's a good chance you're not going to get this. And
Okay.
even if you do, and you're a scholar in the field, you still might not get it.
But he had a lot of elaborate teaching about Elohim, which I thought was all wonderful. But then he digressed sometimes with the Yah stuff. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's the one thing that Marcion is usually known for. The other thing that he's known for is being the first to establish his own New Testament canon. And his canon consisted of a version of the Gospel of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters. So he doesn't have 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, or Titus, which are known as the pastoral letters, but he has the other 10 letters of Paul. And he has a version of the Gospel of Luke that looks a little bit different than what we have. It's probably about half the size of it. And so that's his 11-book canon. And then there's a 12th book that is his own thing, which is called the Antitheses, which are basically where he's pointing out all the contradictions, antitheses meaning like antithesis, like contradiction, pointing out all the contradictions of the Old Testament. And I think that provides the basis for his reading of the Old Testament, is that all these contradictions show that there are actually like these two sources. Now, most people interpret him as saying there's two gods, but I think that like these two gods are meaning there's the Yahweh source, like all the verses that have to do with Yahweh are depicting God in one way, but all the verses depicting God as Elohim are depicting God in a different way. And that he's saying the Elohist version is the right one, and the Yahwist version is the one that was added to it and is not accurate. I might be giving him too much credit, but I think that's what
so I have a
is
question
very clearly
here.
taught by the Ebionites. And so if he's getting his information from the same source, then that's probably what he was teaching. Go ahead. Go ahead, Kathy.
I think we're cutting out a little. What was the name of that book that Marcion wrote?
It's called the Antitheses, and we don't have that anymore. It's been lost to history. We only have a few fragmentary quotes from it.
Well, I mean, in a Google search, you should be able to find some of the quotes on it, right?
Maybe there's not much. You get maybe some from Tertullian and some from Irenaeus, maybe some from Epiphanius. But basically, those are the two things that Marcion tends to be known for. Is he was the first to establish a canon. And what's interesting about his version of Luke is that Irenaeus was the first to call the Gospel of Luke, and first to even make mention of it, really. And he makes mention of it as saying that Marcion cut up the Gospel of Luke and removed a bunch of stuff he didn't like, and that's how he got to his text. But now when we do linguistic analyses and reconstructions of the text, and it's fairly evident that it's the opposite, that the canonical Luke that we have is actually Marcion's gospel with stuff added to it rather than the reverse. And so we'll talk about that maybe more in detail a little bit later, of like the Gospel of Luke. But basically this canon that Marcion had, like that's what his followers were using. And so Paul was a very influential character in Marcion's teachings, because 10 of his 11 books in his canon were Paul's letters. And then he had a gospel, which wasn't from Paul. Any questions about Marcion?
No.
All right, so according to Irenaeus, Marcion learned from this guy named Cerdo, and Cerdo learned from Simon. And Simon was a disciple of John the Baptist, who evidently sort of became the guy in charge after John. Depending on your source, some say Dositheus was temporarily the guy, but then Simon took back over. But whatever, like Simon ends up being the guy who succeeds John the Baptist, and then Cerdo and Menander are the two guys who come from Simon. Then Marcion comes from Cerdo. Now, Menander, he's sort of the other guy that comes from Simon, and he has two followers that are both considered Gnostic. There's Basilides and there's Saturninus. And Saturninus is teaching in Antioch, and Basilides is teaching in Alexandria, Egypt. And so Basilides has his own following, and Saturninus has his own following. And they're both go back to Menander, who go back to Simon.
Okay.
So an interesting thing with Basilides, I don't know that there's anything really special and unique about what he's teaching that's different from like Saturninus and Menander and Cerdo and Marcion. It's just kind of this general Gnostic teaching with all like the eons and pleroma and all that stuff, which maybe we'll get into the details of that another time. But one thing that's interesting pertaining to this genealogy is that according to Basilides, he got his information from Matthias, who got his stuff as a secret teaching from Jesus.
Oh.
Now these secret teachings are a huge part of the early Gnostic movement, and I'm still trying to piece together exactly who's responsible for these secret texts, but the word Gnostic means knower. It's from the word gnosis, which just means knowledge.
Yeah, knowledge.
Yep.
And it's got a bad rap, but I've always wondered, if it's got a bad rap, but it maybe shouldn't have a bad rap entirely. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, they're considered the opponents of the proto-orthodoxy, so that's the proto-orthodoxy is the one who describes them in these negative ways. But basically, there were all these books that were like purported to be secret things. So it's like Jesus would teach all of his disciples unique things in secret to each of them, and they'd all write a book saying, "Oh, these are the secret teachings of that Jesus taught to James, in the secret book of John, the secret book of Mary, the secret book of Judas, the secret book of Thomas." Like everyone has a secret book, and so we have a lot of these texts in the Nag Hammadi library and some other places that we found them. So we can actually read some of these secret books, and so that's that theme. And we see this among the canonical Gospels. We see this predominantly in the Gospel of Mark, where it's known as the Messianic secret, where every time Jesus performs a miracle, he says, "Don't tell anyone that this happened." And every time they say, "Oh, you're the Messiah," he's like, "Don't tell anyone." So he's this secret. He's like, "Don't tell anyone this." And so, well, why would Jesus be saying these things? It's because, according to the Gnostics, that he had all these secret teachings. It's like Jesus was this secret person. And so he had all he taught everything in secret to each of his disciples individually, and they all wrote books on the secret things that he said to each of them. And so these like Ebionites who are teaching this like the same doctrine that he taught to everyone, well, they just don't know about the secret teachings that he gave to all the apostles individually. And the Gnostics, we have all the secret teachings, and so you're not going to get those from the Ebionites because they didn't know about these secret teachings. Only we're the knowers, we're the ones who have the secret knowledge. And so when Basilides claims that it was secret knowledge given by Jesus to Matthias, that's where he got his teachings, that aligns him with this tradition of these secret books. And so
you
then
don't have Matthias listed here, do you? You have he's Matthias. How is he? Where is he? You talked about him a lot, but I don't see his name here.
Yeah, he's not on here because these secret texts are, in my opinion, they are not actually what Jesus was doing. He wasn't teaching all these things, because if you actually look at the texts, and I've read the majority of them, I haven't read all of them. Like, there's a lot of text to read through, but I've read enough of them to get a good feel of what's going on. And they're very Greek philosophical. They're very like Platonic in what they're doing, and so they're very much influenced by Greek philosophy. And so when Jesus is teaching things, they're very metaphysical in nature, where it's like the disciple says, teach me about the nature of the universe, and Jesus is like, I'm going to elaborate this like Greek philosophical theory that's very much similar to what Plato taught, and like it looks absolutely nothing like anything that you get from any of the Gospels, and I'm talking like this Greek philosopher instead of like anything that you expect to hear in any of the Gospels. And so I think that that's very much not Jesus's real voice, and that these Gnostic texts, like these secret texts, are basically trying to do something that's not genuine when it comes to portraying Jesus. Okay. So I don't think that these secret teaching of Matthias, I think there was just a secret book of Matthias, which happens to be one that's lost to history, but we have like 8 or 9 that are not lost to history. We just don't have the one that goes to Matthias, but they're very similar to each other, so you can kind of get the gist of probably what it was.
Okay, so where does the book of Thomas come in then? Is that in this group, or is that a different book somewhere else?
Are you talking about the Gospel of Thomas?
Or the Gospel of Thomas, yes.
So Thomas isn't listed here because he tends to not show up as one of the people who there's a lineage that goes to him. So there is like the church in India claims that they were established by Thomas, and like he comes up in some of the literature in some of these texts. But when we're talking about the major groups that exist in the middle of the 2nd century, none of them claim that Thomas was their main teacher. So that's why he's not on this list. Because these aren't texts that we're looking at. These are people that we're looking at today.
Okay. All right.
But I just want to give you the third history of Basilides. So we had the one that claims that he came from Glaucus, or I'm sorry, what is it? Menander coming from Simon. That's what we have here on the chart. And then we have his own, where he says it gets it from the secret teaching of Matthias. But then there's this other source that says that he was a teacher. He got his teachings from Glaucus, not Menander, and Glaucus was a disciple of Peter. So interestingly, we have, instead of Basilides to Menander to Simon, we have Basilides to Glaucus to Peter. And so this is one instance among quite a few where there seems to be this instance in which Simon and Peter are treated as if they're kind of the same person, but then distinguished from each other in some way. So I still haven't put my finger on exactly why, but there's something going on with like Simon's name is changed to Peter, and he becomes Simon Peter, and he's also known as Cephas or Cephas sometimes, like in Paul's letters. And it might have been because like Simon became known as this like leader of the Gnostics, And so we don't want people like Clement learning from Simon the Gnostic. And so we had to make this other character, Peter, that's like very much like not in alignment with the Gnostics. And so that's one explanation that could be like that it was one person that got divided into two characters because there were two different sort of groups later on that wanted to distinguish from each other and wanted to distinguish their origins from each other. That's one possibility. Another one is that they legitimately were two people and that they just were, for whatever reason, conflated in some of these different accounts, which is also a possibility. So I don't know which one is which at this point, but there's something going on there between Simon and Peter. So any questions about like anything about Simon and Marcion?
No.
All right, so now let's look at the Valentinians on the right.
Wait, there is a question.
Okay.
You from Bus? Is it Bus? How do you say that again? Basilides. Basilides. You have him connected to is it Carpocrates and Marcellina?
Yeah.
You didn't mention those two people.
Those were just like the next two generations of his followers. So it was Saturninus. I think he also had some followers. And again, I didn't want to make this too detailed, but I didn't want to make it too like lacking detail. So I just wanted to show that Basilides had some followers, that it wasn't just a dead end. But I think a lot of these people had followers. I just wanted to kind of trace the origin by showing that Menander had Saturninus and Basilides. But I don't really have anything specific to say other than Marcellina is female. So there was a female teacher that came from Basilides.
I see. I do have one suggestion, and it's up to you whether you do, but some of what you just described about Basilides that isn't on here might be interesting. That you have some space there just to put some of those names there. So
okay.
Just FYI, just if you want.
All right.
You did talk a lot about them, so they're kind of like a big part of the talk.
Yeah, and for more information about Basilides and the stuff I'm looking at is Hippolytus, Refutation of All Heresies, Book 7, Chapter 8 is where we could look for more information about this stuff. And that's where Hippolytus, who's writing in the early 3rd century, so in the early 200s, he claims that most of Basilides, his system, is inherited from Aristotle. It's Aristotelian philosophy, which, looking at a lot of these Gnostic texts, they are very much Platonic, Aristotelian, like very much ancient Greek philosophy influenced. So I think I tend to agree with Hippolytus in that assessment.
Okay.
All right, so now let's go to Valentinus. So that's all the way to the right, where the Valentinians are another group that was very popular in the time immediately following the Bar Kokhba revolt, where that's when Valentinus, who came from Alexandria, purportedly, and he began teaching in Rome just after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So apparently a lot of people did go from Jerusalem to Rome, where, Alexandria was a big hub, like these big city sort of trading hubs were tended to be seaport places. So you just look at the sea and you have like Rome on sort of the western part, and you have like the Church of Corinth, which is also over there. And then you have sort of the northern parts of Africa, where you have like Alexandria, and you have Carthage, and then to the right, you have like the Jerusalem area and that whole coast up through like Syria. And then sort of north of that, you get to Asia Minor and those areas. And so those tended to be the major cities in that were responsible for the church's development in the first century and the second century. We see this in like Paul's letters, where he's going to all these different churches around that same kind of circuit, those seaport places. But then in the second century, we see that those major kind of city areas also become the major kind of hubs of the different churches. And that would be expected because that's where the people are. And so if the people are there, that's where the churches are going to be the largest, because that's where there's the most number of people. So it makes sense that that's what would happen. But Valentinus, he was also part of this. He's known as a Gnostic, but his teachings differ a little bit from Marcion, and they differ a little bit from like Basilides and Menander and those guys, where there's still those same sort of core elements, that there's something going on, where they're teaching that there was like this higher God, but it kind of takes on a different form, and it's more systematic, where he kind of goes through with this really detailed exposition, where when we read Irenaeus, he actually gives a pretty good overview of what some of these things mean. And it looks like a lot of these key terms of like, there's 30 eons, and these eons have tetrads, and tetrads have more tetrads, which have decads, and have like the pleroma, and like all these terms that it's not important that you understand what they are right now. But basically that it's all the sort of cryptic way of interpreting the creation story of Genesis. And so that to me indicates that they're also likely originating from this Elohist Yahwist teaching of like two sources mixed together for the Torah. But they have a different take on it. And Valentinus ends up having a lot of followers, where I listed some at the bottom: Heracleon, Ptolemy, Florinus, Axionicus, Theodotus. And Irenaeus mentions that the Valentinians have the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Truth. And those are two texts that were recovered in the Nag Hammadi library. So we could read those ourselves. And I've read the Gospel of Truth, and I've read part of the Gospel of Philip. So you can actually read those. The Gospel of Truth, I think probably the first thing that'll stand out to you, definitely the first thing that stood out to me, is, wow, this sounds a lot like the Gospel of John. So, and it's unclear when it was written, but it definitely existed by the time Irenaeus was writing, which was 180. And Valentinus was teaching in 136 to 155 in Rome. And Irenaeus says that Valentinus was using the Gospel of Truth as one of the books he was teaching from. So that means that according to Irenaeus's attestation, the Gospel of Truth had to exist at least in the middle of the 2nd century, if not earlier.
Okay.
So it's an early text, which means it would have predated some of the things in the New Testament, which we'll talk about later. And so Valentinus, he was a disciple of this guy named Theudas. And there's not much that we know about Theudas, just like there's not much that we know about Cerdo, other than Marcion was his most influential student, and Valentinus was Theodos's most influential student. But he's an important link because Theodos was a disciple of Paul. And so we had Paul teaching Theodos and Theodos teaching Valentinus.
So Theodos is connected to Marcion as well, then?
How so?
You mentioned Marcion just now.
Well, okay, so I would Marcion is definitely influenced by Paul. 10 of his 11 books in his canon are Paul's letters. So clearly he also, I don't know that he's connected to Paul directly or anything, but he definitely treats Paul as like the main authority. But the reason I mentioned Marcion again here is just saying that we have this chain that goes from Simon to Cerdo to Marcion. And then here we have a chain that goes from Paul to Theodos to Valentinus.
Right.
And so there's not much that we know about Theodos or Cerdo, other than they were the link between, the main teachers, which are Simon and Paul, and the main followers, which are Marcion and Valentinus.
Right. And Paul, like you mentioned, Paul's letters, Marcion, a lot of it are made up of Paul's letters, right, in Marcion.
Yep.
So
right.
There's some overlap then, obviously. not necessarily direct connections, but some overlap.
Yeah, and so whenever people say the Gnostics, well, they're referring to Valentinians, Marcionites, and then all these other Simonian groups like Menander, Basilides, Saturninus. But then what's interesting is that they go back to Simon and Paul. That Simon and Paul are the two most influential originators of all these Gnostic groups.
All the
and
Gnostics.
Simon goes back to John the Baptist.
So the influence comes from first John the Baptist to Simon and to Paul, and then all these Gnostic groups are basically getting a lot of their ideas from them. Okay.
Well, I think that there's also additional things that are introduced. So, for instance, we have nothing from Paul or John the Baptist that says anything about these like eons and pleroma and all these things that are the demiurge that's like central to these Gnostic teachings. So it's like they're adding things to it. And I think at least one source that they're adding is this ancient Greek philosophy with like Plato and Aristotle.
Right.
So they're expanding on these systems, but they're systems that originally go back to like Simon, Paul, and John.
Doesn't Paul sort of call out the Gnostics at one point? Like he, I can't think of the scripture, but doesn't he warn against Gnosticism at some point in one of his letters? Or it was the Acts.
You're probably thinking of 2 Corinthians. And I think we've talked about that before at one point where it depends on how you're interpreting Paul, where I'm finding that there's some sort of vastly different interpretations of Paul. Where is he talking about the Ebionites? Is he talking about the Gnostics? Like, who is he talking about? Is he talking about Simon and his followers? And it's not always clear to me what's what. And if you take the book of Acts as accurate history, then you're going to have a different view of Paul than if you just look at Paul's letters in isolation without considering the book of Acts. And so my answer is at this point, I'm not sure if Paul ever addresses Gnosticism, because there is evidence that at least, like, let's say a Sethian form of Gnosticism dates back to the 1st century BCE, where it was a Jewish thing, like probably associated somewhat with Kabbalah, and that it became Christian by incorporating all these like texts that had to do with Jesus and the apostles. But that's kind of another whole big discussion.
Okay.
So there's one other kind of chain that I would like to mention, and that's what's kind of surrounding Polycarp here.
Okay, yep.
So we have above Polycarp, Polycarp is getting his information from John the Evangelist, which may or may not be the same as John the Baptist. If you're just reading the canonical Gospels as they exist, then those would be two separate people, where John the Baptist is like the cousin of Jesus, but then John the Evangelist or John the Apostle is the disciple of Jesus. But then the letters of John might be that same apostle, might be a different guy, John, and then you have John the Revelator, and there's like all these Johns, and it might all be the same John. It might be 4 different Johns. It might be 2 or 3 Johns. Lots of different opinions.
So John, the book of John, is this John the Evangelist? Same person? Book of John?
The book of John?
Yeah, the canonical in the canon.
The Gospel?
The Gospel of John. I said the book. Gospel of John. Is this John the Evangelist, or is that somebody different than the Gospel of John author?
Well, that's up for debate.
It's up for debate. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that's settled. It's definitely not settled within scholarship, and I don't typically. I think the standard apologetic answer is that it's John the disciple, like John the son of Zebedee. So you have like John and James, the sons of Zebedee,
Mm-hmm.
and that this is like John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, is the one who wrote the Gospel of John.
Okay. So John the
Then
Evangelist would maybe be someone else. And then there's the other books, John 1, 2, and 3. Who is that John?
Yep. Well,
We don't
that's the
know
one
a
who's
different
typically
John?
known as John the Evangelist.
Okay.
Then there's John the Revelator, is the one who's the author of the book of Revelation. And then there's John the Baptist. John the Baptist, who's kind of the main character at the beginning of the Gospels, who's baptizing.
Right, that's that's John, the one that comes
those
before the Messiah.
Yeah, those are like the 4 Johns, and like I said, it might all be the same John. It might be 2 Johns, 3 Johns, 4 Johns. Who knows? And then some people say that they think First John was written by John the Evangelist, but then 2nd and 3rd John were written by his followers, so it might even be 5 Johns.
Okay.
I tend to think it's more likely that it's 1 or 2 Johns rather than 4 or 5 Johns, but that's too much for the scope of tonight. But basically what I want to point out here is Peter. So we talked about James being head of the Jerusalem church. We talked about Simon kind of being this main Gnostic person who's following John the Baptist or rises to power right after John. We have Paul, who eventually gives rise to the Valentinians. But now Peter is an interesting character, where I mentioned him in connection with Basilides, where some people sort of conflate Peter with Simon as twice removed teacher of Basilides. But now one thing that is sort of confirmed as what's later became known as the Proto-Orthodox perspective, and that became like the Catholic Orthodox view. And then, of course, the Protestants basically adopted the Church of Rome history. And so this is what you'll typically hear, no matter what church you go to, is this history of Peter,
right?
Which is that he had nothing to do with the Simon Gnostic. And in fact, in Acts chapter 10 or Acts chapter 8, we have Simon Magus, who is Simon the magician or Simon the sorcerer. And that's like Peter has this interaction where he's like, you're trying to buy the Holy Spirit and like blah, blah, blah. But Simon gets baptized by Philip and he's a Christian. And so it's weird how he's like Peter's condemning him, but then also he's getting baptized but he doesn't receive the Holy Spirit and he tries to buy the Holy Spirit, but he gets baptized in water. And it's like, so there's some sort of confusion there, what's going on. But I just want to point out that that's the Simon that's mentioned in Acts chapter 8. And now this is the Peter that's also mentioned in Acts chapter 8 and throughout the Gospels as well.
Okay.
So now Peter, I think you're familiar with this. We've gone over the recognitions of Clement. And we talked about Clementine homilies.
Yep. So
there's this Ebionite tradition of Clement being this follower of Peter. And then but that account is rejected by the Proto-Orthodoxy because that's Ebionite. The Proto-Orthodoxy defines itself against the Ebionites and against the Gnostics. So it's like, we're not any of those Gnostics. We're not the Marcionites. We're not the Valentinians. We're not the Basilides. We're not the Menandrians. We're not the Simonians. We're not any of that. But we're going to take Paul and make him ours. And that's where they get the book of Acts, is basically claiming Paul for themselves. And then they define themselves against the Ebionites too, but they want to claim Jesus and the apostles from the Ebionites. So they're basically taking what they want from the Gnostics and the Ebionites and saying, well, now we're the real ones who are claiming both of these histories, and you guys are doing your own thing that's wrong and just taking stuff from us. And that's basically Irenaeus' main project, is doing exactly that. And he ended up becoming the voice that won out for the Proto-Orthodoxy. So history from Irenaeus' perspective has essentially become the predominant view of at least the Church of Rome, which ended up becoming the dominant church in Christianity. But
Catholic Church.
Yep. But there's also so that's the Clement version that gets rejected, where now what they do here, and you might have to zoom in to see this, where it says Peter and Clement, just above Clement, there's these two names that I wrote really
Yeah.
small because there wasn't much space.
Linus and Anna Anadidas or something.
It's supposed to be Anacletus.
Anacletus. And then there's the first bishop of Rome, first bishop of Antioch.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So now Peter is the one who's attributed as being the first bishop of Rome and the first bishop of Antioch.
Okay.
So now the line that goes to the left, where starting with Clement, is the Church of Rome, and the one that goes to the right, which goes to Evodius/Evodia, that's the Church of Antioch. Okay.
Okay.
So Peter starts two churches. So there's these two lineages that start with Peter. So they see Peter as their source. And now I mentioned that there's these two traditions of Clement. Now, one of the ways, now again, this is depending on which side you're on. If you're on the Ebionite side, I guess I'll start with the Orthodox side. If you're on the Orthodox side, you'll say Clement was the fourth bishop of Rome. Peter was the first, and then there was Linus and there was Anacletus. So Linus was the second after Peter, Anacletus was the third after Linus, and then Clement was the fourth after Anacletus. Yeah, so Clement's fourth, and then they agree on the chain after that, or whatever. So it's the only question is, well, was Linus number 2 and Anacletus number 3 and Clement number 4, or was Clement number 2? And according to the Ebionites, Clement was number 2, where Peter established the church in Rome and appointed Clement to succeed him. And there's no such people as Linus and Anacletus.
Uh-huh.
So if you're looking at it from the Ebionite side, they would say, and I'm kind of putting words in their mouth, but if we just compare the two together, they would basically say, well, the Orthodox Church made up these two characters, Linus and Anacletus, in order to separate Clement and Peter by 2 generations, so that our account, which is the real account of Clement being the disciple of Peter and being the one that Peter put in charge of the Church of Rome, you wanted to sort of say our history is the illegitimate history and you want to make your own. And so you're inventing these characters, Linus and Anacletus, which have no other mentions anywhere, and you're just putting them in there in order to separate Clement from Peter, just for the sole purpose of discounting our version of historical events as Clement succeeding Peter.
Right. And from what we read when we were reading the Clementine literature, right? It really looked like he was Peter's disciple, like that he was.
Right.
Yeah. So.
And he does, in fact, at the end of the book, which I don't think we got to the end of the book, but Peter makes Clement the bishop.
We didn't get to the end. Yeah. He does make him the bishop in the end of the book. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the Ebionite tradition, is that he's number 2 and that there aren't Linus and Anacletus. So then we get all these other bishops that, again, we don't need to really go over those now, just showing that there is this line that
Long
succeeds.
line.
But the main one there is that is it go directly from Peter to Clement, or are these intermediaries, depending on which perspective, whether you agree with the Proto-Orthodox or the Ebionite perspective. That'll determine whether you believe that Linus and Anacletus really existed.
Okay.
So now that's the Rome side. Now there's the Antioch side as well. And Antioch is only mentioned twice in the New Testament. I'll start by saying it's twice in Paul's letters, where Paul mentions Antioch twice. One time it's in a list of places where he says, I was persecuted here, 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 and here. And one of those places is Antioch. He doesn't really say anything about what that persecution was. And the other instance that he mentions Antioch is he says, at Antioch, I confronted Cephas, Peter, to his face about his hypocrisy, because he was eating with the Gentiles. And then whenever these Jerusalem people came from James, he wouldn't eat with the Gentiles, and instead he ate with them, and I was confronting him to his face, and everybody sided with Peter, even Barnabas, and I was left by myself. And so I think that when he says he was persecuted in Antioch, he was likely referring to that episode when everybody basically told him he was wrong when he confronted Peter for not eating with the Gentiles when the Jews showed up. So whether it's two episodes or the same episode, it's unclear, but Antioch seems to be just this kind of minor thing in Paul's letters. But then we see in the book of Acts that Antioch is mentioned 16 times. And so there's 18 total times in the New Testament that it's mentioned. 2 are in Paul's letters and 16 are in the book of Acts. So Antioch is a very central text to the book of Acts, where it's not a central place anywhere else in the New Testament.
Okay.
And if we have time, we can kind of discuss why, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
So the main person who's associated with the Church of Antioch early on, so Peter is the guy who establishes it, but it doesn't just go immediately to Ignatius. There's this intermediary person. Well, Ignatius is the main person who's known as like the main early figure of the Church of Antioch. And so you might have heard of this term. It's the Apostolic Fathers, or the earliest church followers. Earliest church fathers, which I tend to not like that term. That's a very Catholic term, calling fathers, but that's like the ante-Nicene fathers. That's the term. But there's 3 people: Clement, Polycarp, and Ignatius, where basically you have Jesus, you have the apostles, and then the next generation of followers after the apostles who knew Jesus would be Clement, Polycarp, and Ignatius. So they were people who never knew Jesus directly, so they weren't Jesus's direct apostles, but they were disciples of the apostles, and so they were like one generation removed from Jesus and the apostles. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because you have Peter, who was an apostle.
Yep.
And you have Clement, and you have Ignatius, you said? Ignatius and Polycarp, yeah.
So Polycarp is a disciple
Yeah.
of John, which if we think that John the Evangelist is someone different than John the Apostle, then he wouldn't be once removed from a disciple. But if we think of John as a disciple of Jesus, then he would be a disciple of a disciple of Jesus.
Removed.
Yeah. So that's why I think it's probably not some guy who's like someone other than John the Apostle.
Yeah, he probably is an apostle. Yeah.
Yeah, but just kind of putting it out there that Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp they're often spoken of as like a threesome together, as like the 3 earliest sources that we have that aren't the apostles.
Okay.
And so now Ignatius, it's interesting because, again, just like with Linus and Anacletus, separating Peter and Clement, we have Evodius separating Ignatius from Peter. It's like, well, why is that? Well, I think that Evodius is a real person, but I don't think that the person's name is Evodius. I think that the person's name is Evodia. And if we look at Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, and this isn't my own theory, this is there are scholars who came up with this, and I agree, that Evodia is mentioned in Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3. And it's a woman who is basically a disciple and is preaching and teaching. And now I think what happened is they decided, once the Church of Antioch grew in size and was like one of the major forces in the church, and the church became very patriarchal, and like women weren't allowed to be teachers and disciples, that now like Peter was the founder of the Church of Antioch, but now his immediate successor was a woman? No way, we can't have that. Well, what are we going to do about that? We can't just erase them and say Ignatius was a disciple of Peter. So, well, let's change Evodia to Evodius. And if you know anything about Greek names, and I don't really, but I'm just going off of the scholarship who did do a deep dive into this. And basically the name Evodia is a very common female name, Whereas Evodius is a name that nobody ever has. It's like a completely made up name, but it would just be sort of, if you were to try to make the name Evodia masculine, Evodius would be the way to do it. But nobody ever did that. It's just like if, let's say I was talking about Kathy. Well, that's a very common name in English, Kathy, right? But if I were to try to make that name into a male name, if I were to say, well, I need to scrub Kathy and make her someone else, I would need to make her into a man. What would I do? I say, well, let's call her Kathy. And it's like, well, there's Matthew. Yeah, like Matthew is a common male name. So let's say
or Cathodius.
Yeah. And so it's like well, nobody is named Cathew in English. Like I've met 0 people named Cathew. And so it's like, but Kathy is a very common name. Lots of women are named Kathy. And so that's kind of the situation we're dealing with here with Evodius and Evodia, where Evodia is mentioned in Paul's letters. So she's one of the disciples and teachers in the early church, alongside Clement, is mentioned alongside Clement here in this Philippians passage. But then Evodius is nowhere mentioned. And the name Evodius does not exist basically in that language at that time, ever really. And so it seems to be a made-up character, but unlike Linus and Anacletus, it's not completely made up out of thin air to try to separate Clement from Peter, but rather is changed from a female to a male because they were trying to hide that there was the successor to Peter in Antioch was female.
Which sort of, doesn't Paul teach that women can't be head of the church? So that sort of would fly in the face of Paul.
Yeah, and that's again, there's a lot of complicated things to say what dated back to Paul. If we look at Marcion, he was the biggest champion of Paul, and he was the first to canonize Paul's letters, and he canonized the first 10. He did not seem to have any awareness of the existence of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, or Titus for the pastoral letters, and that's where you get the whole diatribe of like women belong, like ask your husbands if you have a question, like don't open your mouth in church, like women are saved through childbearing, like where that might have been, according to some theories, they think that that's like a proto-Orthodox, like when Paul was sort of being claimed by the proto-Orthodoxy, they decided to come up with the pastoral letters. That's one theory as to that.
Right.
Not necessarily the only one. Maybe Marcion just didn't have those letters. But that would be an explanation where you also have the Acts of Paul and Thecla, where Paul is discipling this woman named Thecla. She's a main character. And so that book ended up being decidedly heretical and false because, and the reason that they cited that it's ridiculous is because they all know that women can't be disciples. But if you read the Gospels, clearly that's not the case. And you read the rest of Paul's letters, it's not the case.
Okay.
But anyway, I thought that was an interesting side note about Evodius. And so then you get to Ignatius, where Ignatius is a really controversial figure. He definitely, well, I'd say definitely is maybe too strong of a word, but like there's strong attestation that he existed and that he was the 3rd bishop of Antioch. Now, he has letters that he left behind, and the number of those letters differs depending on who you ask, where it's either, I think, 3 or 4 letters, or it's 7 letters, or I think there's more letters as well, like up to 10 or 12. But there tend to be 7 that are generally agreed on as like, these are the letters of Ignatius. But then there's the short version, or like the short recension, the medium recension, and the long recension. So there's like 3 different versions of each of these letters. I think for the short ones, there's only 3 or 4. They don't have 7 for the short ones. But basically, so the question is, well, which ones are actually what Ignatius wrote? Did somebody go through and was it just the short ones and they just kept expanding them? Was it the longest one and people kept shortening them? Was it the medium one and some shortened them and some expanded them? Like, which ones are actually from Ignatius? And that's a question that's up for debate. And there are people who are doing some today trying to do like intense scholarship to answer that question. the verdict is still out. But one thing that's interesting is that Paul isn't really mentioned in the short versions, but he's like all the Gospels are mentioned like extensively in the longer versions, and Paul is elaborately quoted in the long ones. So it's like, well, he would be the first witness of anything that Paul had to write if we accept the long versions. If we don't accept the long, if we don't accept the long versions, then we get the Epistle of First Clement, which also mentions Paul, but then we don't get anything else until like Marcion and Justin. Justin doesn't even mention Paul in the 150s and 160s. So Irenaeus, I guess. So it's like Marcion is clearly using Paul's letters, and he's teaching in the 140s and 150s. So that would be the basically the earliest time that we could say that people were using Paul, unless we accept the longer version of Ignatius's letters or the Epistle of First Clement. So Paul probably did write prior to that point, but it's not clear to what extent his letters were in circulation and in use, because I think Paul was primarily, there's attestations even within Irenaeus where he says the Ebionites rejected Paul or didn't acknowledge him as an apostle, whereas like the Valentinians were basically building their stuff on Paul, and the Marcionites, Paul comprised like 90% of their canon. So clearly the Marcionites and the Valentinians, like the Gnostics, embraced Paul and were like building their theology on Paul, whereas the Ebionites didn't acknowledge him at all. And so now when the Proto-Orthodoxy tries to say, well, Paul is a main part of our canon, well, okay, like none of the other people on this left side are even really acknowledging Paul. It's the Gnostics who are preserving Paul. And so that's kind of a question. Why is that happening? It's not super clear to me.
The Ebionites come from the Elohist, don't they? They come from the Elohim, that, I don't know how to say it, but wouldn't they come from, maybe you can fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
The Elohim and the Yahweh, the Ebionites would come from the Elohim, right? The Elohist.
Well, so Elohim and Yahweh, that's pertaining to the Torah. So that's like an entirely Jewish thing where we're talking about like how to read Jewish scripture. And so the Ebionites are considered the Jewish Christians. They are Jesus and the apostles in the Jerusalem church. So like they're the ones who are most closely associated with these Jewish concepts. And so when we read, let's say, the Clementine homilies, that's where it goes into more detail about, it calls it like false scriptures is usually the term that's used, but basically detailing all these ways in which like this is the way we're supposed to read the Torah. And yeah, they're very much accepting the Elohist portion of the Torah and rejecting the Yahwist portion of the Torah. And so then
that's what I was thinking, but I wasn't able to put it into words. So yeah.
Yeah, so that's the Ebionites, but then also the Gnostics, their entire system, if we just read it at face value, it just sounds like this like Greek philosophical kind of really super complicated but overly excessively complicated system that ends up being heretical. But if we really examine it more closely and understand the meanings of each of these terms, it was also rooted in this idea of how are we supposed to read, especially the creation story of Genesis. And so I think they are also rooted in this Elohist, Yahwist distinction of how we're supposed to read Torah. And that's why I think, since that's the basis of Gnosticism, and it's also the basis of the Ebionites, and that they both go back to James and John, that I think that goes back to Jesus, is that Jesus was teaching that there's a distinction between Elohim and Yahweh. So that's where I think all the second century stuff actually goes back to first century and back to Jesus. And that's why we get Gnosticism. I think it's largely rooted in that thing, in that way that Jesus and his followers were teaching of how we're supposed to be understanding the Torah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so just kind of to finish off with Ignatius in Antioch, it says that he was the archbishop. Now, the years are a little off depending on what the sources are. We have Peter, who's, existing from like early 30s
53.
to in the 50s. Yep. And then we have Evodius takes over from 53 to either 68 or 83, depending on the source. And then Ignatius picks up whether it's 68 or 83, and he goes
68.
from either to 107 or 115. And then we have some kind of people who don't really play prominent roles throughout history. We have Cornelius, Heron, and then interestingly, depending on which source we're using for the dating, either it goes from, Heron to Theophilus directly, if we say that Heron went to 169, or according to the other source, that there's this vacancy for 5 years between 164 and 169. I'm not sure which is which. It sounds weird that there would be a vacancy.
Okay.
I think they would at least have some kind of interim replacement person and call them the bishop. I don't think that there's probably a vacancy, which would lead me to believe that the source that says it was 142 to 169 is probably the more accurate one if Theophilus comes in 169 to 182. But I haven't looked into that closely enough to know for certain, but that would be my guess, my intuition.
Okay.
But the reason that I wanted to go all the way down this far to Theophilus is because unlike the other ones with the lineage with the Church of Rome, there is something very significant that occurs at this point with Theophilus, Archbishop of Antioch, from 169 to 182. So this name Theophilus, does that sound familiar at all to you?
Yes, it does. You and I have talked about Theophilus, and again, I'd have to have a refresher. But we've talked about Theophilus.
So if you go to the Gospel, Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.
That's mentioned in the canon, yep.
So it says, I'm not an eyewitness to any of these things, but I've followed the matter closely, and I wanted to put together this account as someone who's researched everything thoroughly, and so that you, O excellent Theophilus, will have this accurate understanding.
Yes.
So the gospel, what we have in our Bibles as the third gospel, which is Luke, the gospel according to Luke, it starts out by addressing itself to most excellent Theophilus. Right? So the question is,
do the years match up with that? Do the years match up with that dating then in the canon with this dating? Is it being the same Theophilus?
So that's an interesting question, and it again depends on who you ask. If you ask Irenaeus, he would say, no, absolutely not. It's a different Theophilus, because Luke is a contemporary of Paul, and he's very explicit about this in Against Heresies when he's talking about this. He says, no, Luke is a contemporary of Paul, and the Marcionites, they basically took all this stuff out of the Luke's gospel, and they accept these other parts, but they reject all these parts, and that's why these Marcionites are all crack-brained. He literally uses that term, crack-brained. At least that's the English translation to describe the Marcionites. But then if you look at all this material that he specifically cites, that's sort of at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, well, we literally have Justin speaking 30 years prior to Irenaeus, who's attesting to all these sources that are the source text for all the material in the first two chapters of Luke that he's citing. So he's like, oh, well, all this birth narrative, Marcion rejected all the birth material. Well, that comes from the Gospel of James, which Justin attests to in the year 150 as the source of his birth material. And then he's like, oh, well, he also rejects this story about Jesus like his mom offering animal sacrifice for her cleansing at the temple. Well, that story is not in James, but it's in the Acts of Pilate. And Justin says in the Acts of Pilate, it has this, this, and this. And he names off like 12 things. And all those things are in the existent manuscript that we have of the Acts of Pilate, which is the first half of the Gospel of Nicodemus. So that source text clearly existed 30 years prior to Irenaeus. And then he quotes the story of Jesus in the temple at age 12. And he says, that's also something that the Marcionites cut out. But that comes from the infancy Gospel of Thomas. That's the final story in that book. And so all these texts that Irenaeus is citing, or all these things that are in the Gospel of Luke that he's citing that are not in Marcion's Gospel, are already attested to 30 years earlier in other material. And he's saying, no, this all came from Luke and it's nowhere else. Well, that's false. It is in these other places. And so that's part of what I was saying, how the story that Irenaeus seems to be telling about the Gospel of Luke, like all the evidence points to him having things exactly backwards. That the primary source text for the Gospel of Luke is the Gospel that Marcion is using, and he adds all of the material from these other texts in order to add things to the Gospel, and then he accuses the Marcionites of cutting all this material out, and he tries to use this to discredit them, saying, well, we can't trust anything that they believe because they cut all these stuff out and they believe the other stuff, but then they reject this stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, that's because you took their text and added all this stuff to it. That's why they don't have it. And so that's why with the dating, when you asked me, well, did the dates line up? Well, according to the story that Irenaeus is telling, as Luke being this travel companion of Paul, well, that would put the Gospel of Luke back to the mid 1st century in like the 50s. And in that case, no, it would have to be some other Theophilus, because Theophilus, Archbishop of Antioch, he doesn't become the Archbishop until 169. That would be, over 100 years after the Gospel of Luke would have been written. So I think what Irenaeus is trying to do is he's trying to make the Gospel of Luke sound like it's this really old text and was this contemporary of Paul, because Luke is mentioned a couple times in Paul's letters. So he even makes the case. He's like, well, that's how we know that it's actually that Luke, because Paul mentions that, and Luke was there with me. And so Luke was the eyewitness writing these things down. And he's suggesting that Luke got all this information about Jesus from Paul. And that's how it's legitimate, because Paul's this true apostle. But if you actually read the Gospel of Luke, and then you read Paul's letters, Paul quotes Jesus only like 5 or 6 times total between all of his 13 letters. And the miracles that he mentions about Jesus, he mentions the Last Supper, he mentions the crucifixion and the resurrection, but like he doesn't mention any of the miracles that Jesus performs. Like he doesn't mention the healings of lepers, he doesn't mention like the woman at the well, he doesn't mention like any of those things. So if Luke is really the travel companion of Paul, then like how does Luke have all this information and Paul never shows any knowledge whatsoever of 90% of the material? And then Luke's supposed to be getting it from Paul? Like, how is that supposed to make any sense?
Yeah. It something seems off. Do you think Paul is do you think he's a legitimate source then? Do you think Paul is who, or do you think Paul is a false apostle? Or a false, a follower, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you think Paul, there's a lot, because I know there's controversy around Paul. I mean, some accept Paul, some don't. So where do you land?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I accept Paul. I think there's possible that some of the parts of his letters were redacted or mistranslated, or maybe Paul just, got a few things wrong. Like I don't see Paul as like every word that comes out of his mouth is like the authoritative word of God. I think it's possible that maybe he was too lax about his teaching about like not eating food offered to idols, like not eating the meat to the idols, and that James is correcting him in Acts 15, or something along those lines. But I think that there's definitely something that goes to Paul that's legit, and like I don't reject him, but I think that the thing that Go ahead.
Sorry, I thought maybe you were changing your mind with some of this about Paul, so that's why I asked. But go ahead.
No, so I'm mentioning this because we're trying to understand how the proto-orthodoxy came about. And I'm saying there was originally the Ebionites. That was Jesus and the apostles. It was just this Hebrew group of like I don't know if Jewish is the right word, but basically these were Hebrew people, and it was all about the Hebrew scriptures and the prophets, and like Jesus was this like fulfillment of like the Hebrew Messiah. And yes, he was the apostle, or he was the Messiah for the whole world, but it was like very much like a Hebrew movement at this point. And so that was stage one, was the Ebionites. But then stage two was this Gnostics. Like the Gnostics came about, I think, largely in response to this, this fundamental teaching of there being like this way of reading the Torah where Elohim and Yahweh are not the same God. But the fact that they kind of went in this very cryptic kind of direction, they end up with a system that looks very different from what the Ebionites are teaching. So they're very distinct a couple of generations later, when they're building off of things that Simon's teaching, things that Paul's teaching, and adding all these other sort of Greek philosophical influences and whatnot. So they're looking very distinct. So now you have these Gnostic groups, and you have the Ebionites, and now you have the Proto-Orthodoxy emerging, who's trying to define itself against the Gnostics and against the Ebionites. And part of the way that it does this, it's trying to attract the followers of both by saying, we're the ones who are the truth, and you guys are each in error. So like, yeah, we have Paul, and he's a good guy, he's on our side. So like, Gnostics, come over to us. And like, we have the real version, the complete version of Marcion's gospel with all the these Ebionite texts like added to it, but like, really, this is the way it actually was. And you Ebionites, like, we have the truth. We have like, Paul was actually one of, like, you shouldn't be rejecting him. Here's the book of Acts that like proves that he's been one with the apostles from the beginning. So they're trying to sort of build this new church that is defining itself against the Ebionites and against the Gnostic groups by incorporating their elements from each of them, in order to be like, we were the main one from the beginning, and you guys were offshoots from us. And that ended up being the history that won out, and ended up being what's accepted as the truth. But if you actually look at the sources, I think that it's backwards, that the Proto-Orthodoxy came third after the Gnostics and after the Ebionites.
Of course, the Ebionites came first. Yeah.
So just coming back to this Theophilus point, which is kind of the last point that I have to make today, is, so if Theophilus is archbishop in 169, and this Luke Acts, which are both addressed to Theophilus, so it's clearly whoever's writing the preface for Luke and Acts is writing to Theophilus. If the Gospel of Luke, as we have it, didn't have any of this extra material that's like the Acts of Pilate and the Infancy Thomas and Infancy James, material that Justin is attesting to the existence of 30 years earlier, if that all gets added to Marcion's Gospel in order to form canonical Luke, and that happens, it had to happen sometime after Marcion, which would be like after the 150s and before Irenaeus and 180. Yeah. So it had to happen somewhere between like 155 and 180. So that's like what, a 25-year window that it could have happened to be added.
Yeah.
Well, what happens in that 25-year window? Theophilus becomes Archbishop of Antioch in 169. That's right in the middle of that window. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that would be the perfect time that we would expect the Gospel of Luke to be written. So this is what I think is the Theophilus that it was being addressed to. And so I think the book of Acts and the book of the Gospel of Luke were composed around the year of 169 to Theophilus, who had become the Archbishop of Antioch. So now the question would be, now who wrote it?
Right. So somebody, because Theophilus is mentioned in the book, like you mentioned earlier. So now who wrote it? Yeah.
And so if we think
about
it
to Theophilus.
right? So who are the groups that exist? We have, so this is shortly after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which happens in 136. So if we're estimating
Yeah.
this is written in 170, this would be like, was it 35
40,
years? Yeah, 30
35.
some years
Yeah.
later. And so and if it's expanding on Marcion's text, and it's trying to add all this sort of Ebionite material to the Marcionite text in order to claim that like this is the thing, and he's trying to sell it to basically the newly appointed Archbishop of Antioch. We have the Church of Antioch, we have the Church of Rome. The Church of Rome at that time, the person would have been this Eleuthenus or whatever, whoever that guy is,
Who?
174. This guy at the bottom left. We have Soter, who's 167, 174.
174 to 189. Eleutherus or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess it would be Soter would be the guy in that time frame.
Oh, you're talking about Soter, right? 167 to 174.
Yeah, or if it was, whoever would have been writing it, maybe somewhere in those three at the bottom, if it was the Archbishop of Rome who's doing it. But then we never hear anything about any of these guys. We have no writings from any of them that exist, and no real mentions of them other than they happen to be the Archbishop at that time. Okay, so maybe, but not an extremely plausible candidate. And what about if it was Marcion's followers? Like, would there be a reason for the Marcionite followers to sort of rewrite their own text and send it to Theophilus? Well, maybe. And I actually thought that for a while before I started reading Irenaeus. I thought that was one plausible explanation. But then when you read Irenaeus, he knows like every detail. He's the first one to actually mention Luke as being the author of this text. And he's the first one to attest to this text at all. And he attests to it in like all these super detailed things, saying, and this is like part of his launched attack against the Marcians. And he also uses it against the Ebionites, saying, well, they believe in this birth narrative, but these things, but that are only in the Gospel of Luke. And it's like, no, it's actually in their literature too. Like you actually got it from their literature, the Gospel of James. And so it seems clear to me that by far the most likely candidate would be someone from this proto-Orthodox church that was inherited by Irenaeus. Well, who's Irenaeus? He's the second archbishop of Lyon in Gaul, which is France. He became the archbishop in 177. Well, if Theophilus becomes the archbishop of Antioch in 169, well, who is the archbishop that preceded Irenaeus? That was Pothinus. And he was the archbishop from the beginning, which was around 140, some say 150. I think it's probably right after the Bar Kokhba revolt, just like all these other groups emerged at that time or exploded at that time. So it was probably also around that time. And he was the archbishop until he died in 177, which would have been, unless Irenaeus wrote it, like in the middle of Theophilus's archbishopcy, it was probably Pothinus who wrote it. And Irenaeus then carried the torch and used it against all the other groups. So my guess is that it was probably, if it wasn't Pothinus himself, it was probably that group though, like Pothinus and Irenaeus and the church in Gaul. He was probably writing it to Theophilus. Yep. I think they wrote Luke Acts. Or at least I think that's the most likely explanation that the evidence points to.
Mm-hmm.
So now you know who might have written the book of Acts. It might have actually been the gospel according to Pothinus. But again, this is kind of theoretical. There's no way to know for sure. But I think that when we look at the history, we want to be as informed as possible.
So you want to find out more about Pothinus, right? So how much more is out there about Pothinus? Have you you have another sequel to this, now a bunch of stuff about Pothinus, or?
So I don't really have a lot to say about Pothinus, but there's not much about him. Most of what we know about him is from Irenaeus. But Pothinus, apparently what happened, he lived to be 90 years old. So he lived for a long time, 87 to 177. And He evidently died a martyr's death, where basically a bunch of people from the church in Gaul, Lyon, they were rounded up by the authorities and questioned about all these accusations that were made against them of like uh, torturing babies and all kinds of other weird stuff. And they were saying no, 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 and they were saying like that stuff's not happening. That's against our values. We wouldn't do those kind of things. These are things that were made up, accusations, false accusations against us, and they wouldn't renounce their faith. And they claimed that they said, well, we're Christians, and they were tortured, and they ended up being Pothinus died as a result of his tortures while he was in jail, like 2 days afterwards. And then the rest of the group were fed to wild beasts in the amphitheater. That's the story. And again, I don't know. It all comes from like one letter, which I think is attributed to Irenaeus. So maybe he made that up. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. But that's the story. I think that's really all we really know about Pothinus is what comes from Irenaeus. But considering he's like the successor of Pothinus, I think he's probably the guy who would know the most. And most of the things that Irenaeus says is rooted in truth. But then I think he rearranges some things that benefit him and his group. And that's why I think like the Luke Acts is one such thing that I think he rearranges. But I think the information about Pothinus being his predecessor is probably accurate.
Okay.
And then he says Pothinus comes from Polycarp, which is the bishop of Smyrna.
Yeah. Right.
So I think that's
under
probably accurate.
John the Evangelist, right? Under John the Evangelist.
John the somebody, one of the 5 Johns.
Yeah.
One of the 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 Johns.
Evodia. Very interesting.
So now that we've kind of gone through all this, I'm sure this is like a lot. Your mind's spinning about going through all this stuff, but
Pretty
is there
much.
anything that stood out to you that you're thinking like, wow, I really want to learn more about this, or this is really interesting?
Well, what stood out to me is kind of like a semi-answer, although we don't know for sure, but probably because my biggest thing has been like, when did the church gear off, excuse me, from its early inception with Jesus and the Ebionites and, James being the first bishop, and it going down a Jewish path to suddenly, going down for what looks like suddenly going down, the Rome, the Greek, just everything kind of switching is the revolt that you mentioned. So to me, that seems like that's really, really, like you said, that's really, really significant. Like a lot of the rest of what we talked about was sort of born from somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
As you map it all out the way you do with the time frames and stuff. So to me, that's what really stands out to me today is, it's a semi-answer as to how we got where we're at. Minus a lot of details yet, and minus a lot of not really knowing for sure, but yet knowing more now than knowing enough to kind of point to that, I think, to say that's probably got off track at that point.
Yeah, I think that the more I look into 2nd century Christianity, the more relevance I see to the Bar Kokhba revolt, where a lot of people, they think of it as, oh, well, that was just something that happened in Jerusalem to like Jewish people at that time. Like, wow, the church is like, we were in Rome at that time, and like, that we were barely affected by that. But that's like very much church history from the perspective of like Greek Christians living in Rome. But that's like at that point in church history, that was by far the minority of the total Christians in the world that existed. And so that would be like the history for 5% of the church, not for most of the church. And so I think that maybe the church is the wrong word, but most forms of Christianity at this time were greatly impacted by this event, because prior to that point, like I said, the Jerusalem church was the head church, because that was the one that was established as the head from the beginning under James, and they all had Hebrew bishops until the Bar Kokhba revolt, and afterwards, starting with Marcus, they were all Greek. Now, did they just like change their names to Greek in order to avoid persecution, but they were still Hebrews? I don't know, maybe. Were they now somehow run by Greeks? I don't know, maybe. But certainly something significant happened to the Jerusalem church at that time. And that was the time when this church in Gaul first originated, was right at that time. And then the next in command, Irenaeus, ended up shaping the entire Proto-Orthodox history. So something very significant happened in Gaul at that time. And the Marcionites, that's when Marcion and Valentinus started teaching in Rome and had their big following. So though, like, Gnosticism was exploding at that time, and the Proto-Orthodoxy was beginning at that time, and the Jerusalem church was transforming in a big way in that time. And so, like, that was, like, I think one of the most formative periods in church history.
Yeah. It would be interesting to find some Jewish history around that time and see what they say about that revolt. Do they, because we're studying this as Americans, who come from this largely Hellenistic sort of, takeover of the faith. What do you know anything about their history during this period of time, from a Jewish point of view?
Yeah, there's quite a bit that's said. I know that Josephus has some things to say about, like, the Jewish wars, but Josephus, he talks a lot about the temple destruction. But then there's, like, we have more sources. I think Pliny, we have various sources just in, like, I think the Talmud talks about it, and basically any Jewish historian. I know Professor Abramson has a YouTube channel where he has a whole bunch of videos that are good resources for Jewish history. And it's like there's a lot that we do know about the Bar Kokhba revolt just from, like, the Roman perspective. They recount what was happening. The Jewish perspective, they recount what's happening. It's like a really big thing that, like, lots of people are talking about, because it's like the biggest event that really occurred in this side of the Common Era. For Judaism, I mean.
Right. Bigger than the destruction of the temple, even. So
I think so, yeah. Those are definitely number one and number two. But I think that this one was even more transformative, at least in terms of, like, like, they couldn't go back basically for quite a while, and the entire city was leveled. So it was like the destruction of the temple magnified on, like, a bigger scale.
Yeah. Well, and it really kind of changed the trajectory of the early church.
Right.
Entirely. If you think about it becoming so Hellenistic as it has.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's a form of anti-Semitism creeping in, a takeover back then.
And I'm speculating here, but I think that it's a very plausible explanation that to this point, Christians were identified as being kind of a form of Judaism. And so when the Bar Kokhba revolt came about, it was like there are the Jews who are, like, killing all these Roman soldiers. And so, like, the Jews are killing the Romans. Now the Romans are destroying the Jews and casting out the Jews from their homeland. And now the Jews are trying to, like, go into, like, the diaspora, into all these places and find refuge because they're cast out of their homeland. And, like, that's the mentality here. And so just like we see today, where, like, anytime something happens where there's like someone who's Jewish or someone who's Islamic or someone who is of some minority group does something, then there's all this backlash where it's like, oh, well, you're Jewish, so I'm going to punch you because like I disagree with what, you know, this person did who's Jewish, or I'm going to like be Islamophobic because there's like this person who said Allah Akbar and like, you know, killed people. And so I would imagine that since this is like on a much larger scale than those kinds of things, that the response, even in places like uh, Rome and Alexandria and Gaul, that there probably was backlash where there were these like basically Roman alleged people who were like, oh, you're a Christian, that means you're Jewish. And like, you just like killed a bunch of Roman soldiers. And so like, I'm going to persecute you. And so I'm speculating. I don't know that this happened, but that could be an explanation for what happened or purportedly happened with Pothinus's death, where they were persecuted in Gaul around that time. And it could also be why like certain groups tended to distance themselves from Judaism. So they're like, no, we're not Jews, we're Christians. And Christians are like, you know, we're as much Greek and Platonic as, you know, as your Roman, Greek worshipping, pagan religions are. So that could have been part of the motivation to identify as non-Jewish, was in response to the sort of backlash from the Bar Kokhba revolt. Again, I'm speculating though.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. You'd make a good historian.
Kind of what I'm trying to do here. I'm more interested in like, I know that like I do find this interesting, but I find it secondarily interesting. Like what I'm really interested in is the relationship between ideas. So I'm interested in the source criticism and the texts. Like, how did we get these ideas? How did we get these texts? How did these groups think these things and practice these things and teach these things? So this is kind of like, in order to understand those things, we have to understand the relationships of the groups and the people involved. So this is kind of like setting the stage for the things that I'm really interested in. So I'm not as interested from this perspective as I am in like the texts themselves. So
I
was going to ask you kind of like what things you might be interested in learning more about. Like some of the things that I have, we have like the Ebionite literature, where like in the Clementine homilies, we have the discussions about the false texts, like how to read Torah in these two different ways. We have stuff that I could talk about with like the Gospel of Luke, like the construction of Luke Acts, and some of the source material that Justin attests to that existed prior to this, and even maybe looking at Irenaeus and the things that he talks about, and maybe looking at those arguments ourselves and saying, hey, in light of all the evidence, do we believe Irenaeus or do we think he has it backwards? We could also, we don't have Marcion's text to look at because they don't exist, but we could look at like the Gospel of Truth, which is one of the main texts that the Valentinians are using. So we can look at some of the Gnostic literature to get an idea of what those systems look like. That's another thing that we can do. Those are all kind of things that are on the table.
I would like, if I may, to say, I would like all four. You know, we could do each group systematically.
We also have the Torah itself, that we can read the Torah the way that they're saying to read it, but maybe we should read the Ebionite version of how we're supposed to read the Torah before we would then read the Torah.
But I was going to say, maybe we could do that first, and then we do how it became two versions, like you said. How did it get to be the Elohist and the Yahwist, and then the Book of Truth? You mentioned that. That really sounded, when you mentioned the Book of Truth, when we're talking about the Valentinians, I really am interested in. So all of it, really, if we could, that'd be great.
All right, so we'll look at the some parts of the Clementine homilies that talk about how to read Scripture. You can look at the Gospel of Truth from the Nag Hammadi library, and we can look at some of the source texts for the Gospel of Luke, and we can look at how to read the Torah
Luke
from this
Acts, how to
Elohist
read the
Yahwist
Torah, yeah.
perspective. Yeah, Luke
Yeah.
Acts together.
Yeah.
All right. And if
Yes.
anybody else watching this afterwards, maybe if you have some suggestions, if one of those topics sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments. All right. Do you have anything else to say before I end this?
I don't. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.